Part 2 of my series on early humanity takes a look at how people moved out from Africa, developed farming, and eventually built cities. Examining the prehistories of the various continents from an environmental perspective and their plant and/or animal domestication potential can help to explain why some peoples adopted urban life and others remained hunter-gatherers. That is not to say that one lifestyle entirely supersedes the previous, however. Foraging continued for early agriculturalists, and modern industry is still dependent on food supply from cultivation and livestock rearing. In that sense, therefore, we never really left the Neolithic. Eurasia is the continent that came to dominate the world, and that is largely down to the early development and diffusion of agriculture, with more emphasis on the latter. It was abundant in plant and animal species that were suitable for domestication, and although the woolly mammoth was hunted to extinction, many medium-sized creatures remained to be herded and bred. Eurasians adopted a sedentary lifestyle quickly, and lived in close contact with their livestock, which gave them thousands of years to build up immunity to diseases that jumped the species barrier. However, their head start over the Americas was less important than the accident of geography that allowed them to borrow innovations along the line of latitude that meant cross-continental travel from China to France was a relatively straightforward affair versus the deserts, rainforests and mountain ranges in the Western Hemisphere. A crucial distinction, however, must be made between Eurasia and Eastasia, one that helps us to understand why it was that the Europeans and not the Chinese were the ones to colonize the Americas. On paper, China was unified, centralized and monolingual for thousands of years, versus Europe's tremendous fragmentation. In practice, a single polity answering to just one emperor was detrimental to progress, because if a despot held power, various technologies could be rejected and harebrained schemes dismissed. Columbus asked 4 other princes of Europe to sponsor his expedition west, before he was at last given the go-ahead by Queen Isabella of Spain. Europe's peninsular geography encouraged the creation of rival centres of power, and it was this competition that accelerated the adoption of technologies with which to colonize. By 1492, the Americas had developed sophisticated societies based on agriculture, but still using predominantly stone tools, and without horsepower or labour-saving machines. They had domesticated llamas and alpacas, but they did not use them to pull ploughs or ride them into battle. Like in Eurasia, there were megafauna, but these went extinct within a couple of centuries after the arrival of human beings, whether due to excessive hunting or a change in climate. When Europeans arrived in the 15th century, there were only 2 major civilizations, that of the Aztecs and the Inca. The rest of the Americas' population were still primarily hunter-gatherers, or nomadic pastoralists, moving with their herds. These people were overwhelmed by Europeans with steel swords, muskets, and wheeled carts. Where the Americas are genuinely new in terms of when they were colonized from Africa, Australasia is relatively ancient. The oldest cave paintings are thought to have been created at least 28,000 years ago, and the first human populations arrived more than 50,000 years before the present. This is surprising when we look at modern Australia. To Europeans, the smallest continent seems inhospitable and is mostly desert. Without modern technology, survival seems almost impossible. Indeed, then as now, the country was very sparsely populated. Its people were hunter-gatherers and remained so until European settlers arrived in the 19th century to colonize. Despite their head start over Eurasians, they had not moved out of the Stone Age. Even the mountain-dwelling inhabitants of New Guinea had developed farming where aboriginals remained in their human time capsule state. At the opposite end of the spectrum is Polynesia and Madagascar, which were settled relatively recently by Southeast Asians expanding out of Taiwan, bringing their knowledge of farming where they went. Farming began in Eurasia over 10,000 years ago, and was indigenous to a stretch of land known as the Fertile Crescent, from Jericho in Israel to northern Iraq and the border with Iran in the east. Neighbouring Anatolia, in modern-day Turkey, adopted this mode of life and spread it across Europe. In addition, people from the Ukrainian steppe domesticated horses and also migrated west, carrying their Proto-Indo-European language, from which most major European languages are descended, with them. These two peoples left their genetic imprint on all modern Europeans. Ancient hunter-gatherers are not genetically similar to us, but ancient farmers are. The Mesolithic Cheddar Man, who lived 9,000 years ago, was unearthed in Somerset in the early 20th century. He had dark skin and blue eyes. This was prior to the Anatolian and Ukrainian waves of immigration. Apart from physical characteristics, it was these first farmers who introduced lactose tolerance into the genes of Britain. Modern Sardinians are the closest genetically to prehistoric Anatolian farmers, at over 80%, and Scandinavians have the largest steppe component, although this is only about 55%. Mesopotamia, in modern-day Iraq and Syria, is known as the cradle of civilization. This is because it was home to the world's first cities, sustained by irrigated agriculture, and built of clay bricks, which baked and preserved a record of these cultures in the earliest known writing, mostly concerned with contracts, administrative letters, school exercises, and loans. Some of these ancient settlements have been continuously inhabited, such as Aleppo and Damascus. The first writing served primarily as a memory aid and did not correspond to phonetic sounds. Later, however, an alphabet was developed known as cuneiform, and was probably only used by professional scribes, who could now dedicate themselves to a career of letters because of the food surplus made possible by organized agriculture. Thus, a population of generalists became specialists, and nobles, priests, bureaucrats, and merchants were born.